Right, good evening everyone. Are we okay at the back? Can we hear me okay? If I don't use the microphone, absolutely fine. Right, good evening and welcome to our Human Rights Brexit Hustings as we enter the final week before polling day on Thursday, June the 8th. My name's Harvey McMillan and I am your moderator for this evening, which has been organised by the Leeds branches of the Open Rights Group, Amnesty International and Global Justice. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the candidates for Leeds Central. I'm joined by Hilary Benn from the Labour Party, Ed Carlisle from the Green Party, Bill Palfreman from UKIP and Andy Nash from the Liberal Democrats. The Conservative and Christian People's Alliance candidates were unfortunately unavailable this evening. Now, in terms of how this evening will work, each candidate will have a maximum of 5 minutes to deliver an opening statement on human and digital rights, followed by 3 prepared questions that I have here, which each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer. I ask that the candidates please do stick within the time to ensure that there is time at the end to get questions from our audience. If you do go over the time, I will tell you to stop. As I said, we will then open the floor to you, the audience, who may ask any questions you may have. There is no obligation for each candidate to answer, so please feel free to ask targeted questions to specific members of our panel, as well as more generic ones. Right, so we'll begin now with the opening statements. We're going to start with Hilary. Just 5 minutes.
Well, Harvey, thank you very much indeed. Can I thank Amnesty Leeds and Global Justice and the Open Rights Group Leeds for organising today's hustings, and to you for rearranging it in the light of the Manchester attack, which I suspect may figure in some of the discussion that we have this evening. The first thing I wanted to say about the EU, I was a passionate Remain campaigner. Here we are just almost a year on from the referendum result. Unfortunately, those of us who voted Remain, we lost, and Britain is now leaving the European Union, and therefore the question is how we get the best possible deal and the best possible arrangements out of that process, and I'm happy to talk about that further. I would say in relation to data in particular, there's obviously a lot of very important European legislation. The government says that it wants to incorporate existing rules insofar as they're not already in our law through this thing called the Great Repeal Bill, otherwise known as the Great Retrenchment Bill. I think the job of the next Parliament is to ensure that those rules and laws are fully incorporated. Parliament can then subsequently take a decision about what it wants to keep or not, but what we've got to guard against is people trying to pick bits out that they don't like during the course of that process. We also have to ensure that we get a deal on data transfer, because we have a lot of data centres in Britain, including here in Leeds. And when I met the tech sector in my role as chair of the Brexit Select Committee, they said, unless we get a data adequacy decision from the EU Commission, then we could be in difficulty about the handling of data involving citizens from the remaining 27 member states of the European Union if the data is being handled in the UK. So it's important that we get that right. Secondly, on the Investigatory Powers Act, which I'm sure we will discuss, I think this was legislation that was required to update the law in the light of court judgments, but crucially, advances in technology. The bill was amended during the course of its passage through the Commons and the Lords, and in the end, it's how we strike the balance between absolute rights to privacy, on the one hand, and protection of us as citizens on the other, and getting the balance right is absolutely crucial. The Espionage Act, well, the draft Law Commission consultation document on the new Espionage Act has had a lot of criticism, not least because of its proposal for greatly increased sentences. I think there's, even from the current government, there's been rowing back. I think a spokesperson from Number 10 said, well, this was the last Prime Minister's process, and we've no intention of locking up journalists and whistleblowers. So I'm absolutely opposed to doing either of those things. We'll have to see what the outcome is. And finally, on the Human Rights Act, the last Labour government put the Human Rights Act on the statute book. I'm really, really proud of the fact that we put the Human Rights Act on the statute book. I'm really, really opposed to the Conservatives continually saying they wish to replace it with something called a British Bill of Rights, because if anyone tonight could explain to me, and we don't have a Tory candidate here, how British rights differ from the human rights that were contained in the European Convention that we as a country helped to draft at the end of the Second World War. And the fact that we put the Human Rights Act on the statute book, making it easier for people in this country to access their rights rather than having to make the long journey to Strasbourg, frankly, defeats me. And the fact they haven't been able to do it thus far is because there's some Tory MPs and certainly loads of peers who are resolutely opposed to this. So we must maintain and protect the Human Rights Act, because in the end it's there for all of us. Thank you very much.
We are now going to be using microphones for our live stream that we have over here, so we'll go to you now, Bill. You have 5 minutes.
Hi, I'm Bill Palfreyman, the UKIP candidate. I'm very pleased to be coming to this today because I think these issues here are going to be the big, crucial, the nub issues of the political changes in this country as the EU issue recedes and the distinction between going down an authoritarian road or a more libertarian road in future start to become much more electorally meaningful. Particularly, I think from what I hear of the Espionage Act, this is grotesque. I mean, why would jailing people for these things? This is behaviour of authoritarian states around the world. You know, you can't have a free society that jails whistleblowers and things like that. But particularly, I think particularly also the question of digital rights. I mean, this is I'm in the IT business myself. I've worked with encryption really for 20 years, and it's end-to-end encryption is the bedrock of the IT business, of the internet business. You don't have a business without it. And the idea that you can just give the government encryption keys, SSL keys, is insane. I mean, that guarantees that you don't have end-to-end security. And as soon as you do that, you're no longer you can't trust that system. Inevitably, there are always corrupt people in the world. You can't, with corruption, you can build a system that means corrupt people aren't able to do any harm. You can't build a system that relies on people being good. That is something that universally fails, and it fails in a way that bad people rise to the top. So I can think of it. It's almost a sort of. It sort of horrifies me because you can see Theresa May and to an extent David Cameron. They're just at that slight generational difference where they weren't working with internet technologies in the early part of their career, and so it's still something they're relying on advisors to tell them about. And instead of so there's no instinctive feel for it. She listens to a civil servant. The civil servant sets out a range of options, and she picks this one, right? But that's such a bad way to do it. You have to start from the principle that you let people do these things. You let people be free online and in general with free speech, and then. You know, you worry about people committing crimes when you have some evidence of them having committed a crime, right? And, you know, in real life, evidence for crimes is very easy to find. Somebody does something wrong, there's a victim, right? So, I do think this is going to become a crucial issue, and I think that as UKIP pivots away from being a exclusively anti-EU party, as the EU recedes in importance, I think the issue of civil liberties and personal freedom will become ever more central to UKIP, is already becoming so, in fact. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now move to Arden. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting us here today, as Hilary said. My career background hasn't been entirely relevant to other hustings, but like Bill's it is to this one. I've also worked in telecoms and for ISPs, which means I've got a fair understanding of the technologies involved on the digital side at least. There's a scale of issues there that is only going to grow larger and larger. But if you're attending today, then you probably know this already. We need more people in Parliament with specialist skills, be they former teachers, health workers or scientists. And speaking of scientists, I'd encourage any of you who know anybody in Cambridge to vote for our candidate, Dr. Julian Hooper, who is not only a scientist but is also very strong on digital rights and other rights issues. The threats to rights come from a variety of sources. We've got companies whose commercial interests drive them in the wrong direction or nudge them too far. We've got governments who do have a responsibility for keeping us safe, but sometimes that leads them to overstep the mark. We have press intrusion, we have discrimination. In the field of rights, one of the most important words to keep in mind is balance. We must find the balance between security and our rights. We must balance the need for freedom of expression and our rights. As Liberals, you'll not be surprised to hear this, we Liberal Democrats obviously believe we've got to strike the right balance between our rights and those of others. That's fundamental to liberalism, which I'm absolutely a fan of. In the light of Manchester, these issues are sadly likely to move front and centre, and they have to a certain degree already. But we mustn't have knee-jerk reactions. We've got to review thoroughly, and there may be lessons to learn, and if there are lessons to learn urgently, then yes, of course, we've got to get involved and fast. But fundamentally, we must stop and think. They've been expecting an attack like this. This hasn't come out of the blue. They've been waiting for the one that got through. So, we shouldn't be too surprised. We must be utterly saddened and shocked, but not entirely surprised that something has got through. That doesn't necessarily mean we can't do more, of course. We believe we should be free from an overreaching state, and we would guarantee the individual freedoms guaranteed by the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights. Clearly Brexit has a role to play here. Clearly the Conservatives are going to use Brexit as an excuse to roll back all sorts of things. It's very disappointing, I'm afraid. I have to call Hillary out on this yet again. Voting for Article 50 has given them a blank cheque. It has allowed them more leeway in the coming negotiations than they would have done, they would have had otherwise. And yes, I appreciate Labour couldn't have stopped them on their own, but it could have at least shown a clear message and also encouraged some Conservative Remain MPs to show some strength, let's say. Other policies we have, our manifesto is just chock full of things that help guarantee rights of those who live here and others around the world. We'd like to enshrine the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in UK law. We'd like to strengthen legal rights and obligations for couples by introducing mixed civil rights partnerships and extending rights to cohabiting couples. It's things like that just our manifesto frankly just drips off really. You'll know that we've long fought a campaign to defend us from the draconian overreach of the Investigatory Powers Act. What we have against that, one of the main things we have against that is the mass retention of data. Okay, that is what has been allowed to happen. We collect phone records, itemised phone records, sure, but we don't collect information on the type of phone calls you make. If we collect internet connection records, that means we know exactly what kind of website, what kind of service is being used. And that is an extension of the powers we have now in other technologies. So that's one of the key reasons we did oppose it. Unfortunately, it is now law, and that's very much for regret. We'll obviously continue to fight for single market membership, which means staying under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. We will fight for freedom of movement as well, which is a fundamental right that we've benefited from, and we really would not want to lose. And we'll fight to retain all of the other rights that we benefit from in connection with the EU. There are countless organisations we're a part of and things that help us by being part of that. We can't let any of those be rolled back. On the Human Rights Act, we're completely clear. On freedom of expression, we'd commence Part 2 of the Leveson inquiry. We would ensure delivery of independent self-regulation. We don't think the government has gone far enough. We think they should have done more with that lengthy and expensive investigation they conducted. So I'd like to finish off by saying, with Liberal Democrats, you know what you're getting. Our values are your values. If you're in the Open Rights Group, for example, or looked at your values on the website, they could have been part of our website. It's an exact match, and our record shows it. So do consider sending a clear message to those who would accept changes to our current setup, and those who would actually actively like to roll back our current setup by voting for Liberal Democrats in the coming election. Thank you very much.
And we will now have our final statement from Ed Carlisle.
Right, so good evening. As the others have said, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for organising this, to all those who've organised it. I think thank you particularly because, speaking personally, and perhaps unlike any of the other three who all do seem to be in some way or another experts in this field, I am not an expert. I've never worked in IT, so I think I've heard of SSL, but I don't know quite what it is. I've studied a bit around human rights when I did my Masters in Peace Studies, and I've certainly taken the opportunity in the last few days to really look at this and research, so hopefully I'll be able to hold my own. Please bear with me if I don't. And I think I'd also say, I think we sometimes look to politicians as the experts, and they need to have all the answers. I think this might be a bit of a cop-out, but I genuinely am seeing tonight as much an opportunity to learn and listen as to pontificate and tell you why my views are the best and you should vote for me. Anyway, so yes, I'm standing with the Green Party here in Leeds Central, and I do think it's fair to say that we have a lot of similarities with the Lib Dems. So we do have a good track record on human rights stuff. Caroline Lucas has particularly kind of fought hard and sent out strong messages around the Great Repeal Bill and all the threats that poses to us if that goes through, as possibly some of the Conservatives and others would like it to see it go through. We're utterly committed, as I think most people are, I don't know, utterly committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, etc. We actually, I think there are some overlaps with the Lib Dems as well about wanting to actually see an extension of human rights around conscientious objection, for example, and the rights of the child. Some really good stuff either in our manifesto for this year or some other policy statements we've come out with in the last year or so. I just really want really looking at the way in which the stripping back of legal aid has really kind of imbalance the field. So it's all very well having a kind of well-functioning justice system, but actually if the legal aid systems and the support isn't there, actually the power absolutely remains with those with power and money already, and against, I don't know, your underdogs, I suppose. Hopefully TTIP is disappearing onto the horizon, I don't quite know, but again, the Green Party stood out strongly. Not exclusively, but we did stand up strong about the concerns that TTIP and deals like it proposed. And also one other thing on this, of really fought for the idea that actually we should really embed human rights into our foreign policy. And I mean, this feels like a no-brainer, but our arms policy, like, why would you ever sell arms to countries who have questionable human rights? And yet successive governments have done exactly that. Just kind of particularly on data stuff and internet stuff, again, our 2017 manifesto states clearly our resistance to state and corporate surveillance, that we would definitely support a digital Bill of Rights, which I think the Lib Dems, I don't want to claim credit for it because I think possibly the Lib Dems have pushed that one and we would support that fully. Again, absolutely looking to repeal the Snoopers Charter, also known as the Investigative Powers Act. Which apparently, as I was doing my research, apparently China have cited it as to kind of bolster their own kind of rights to snoop. So saying, well, the British do it, so it must be all right for us to do, which I thought was curious. Other things, wanting independent oversight of the security services, I mean, I think the others have all said it, but the Espionage Act seems deeply, deeply troubling. It crossed my mind, we shouldn't be locking whistleblowers up, I think we should be giving them knighthoods. Medals and anything else they want, really. The idea that we want to lock them up for up to 14 years seems mad. Another one that I'd be keen to explore tonight, and it might well be that others in the audience know more than me, but I gather the European Court of Justice basically said that general mass surveillance is unlawful, so I kind of wonder where that leaves things like the Snoopers Charter, but maybe post-Brexit, if Brexit happens, I don't know, the Tories will do what they want. So, finally, I suppose, speaking personally, my default has always been towards, I suppose, liberalism. I was really interested by a story years ago, which, again, if somebody can enlighten me about now, that'd be great, because I've tried to do some research and never found out. Apparently, ID cards were introduced in the Second World War. And then they continued after the Second World War just by default. A Leeds man was the one who kind of stood up to some police officers because he was a libertarian and said, I don't have a card and I refuse to carry one. And it started a court case which then actually saw the whole unwinding of that whole process. That would be, and with the NHS currently bringing their entitlement cards in, it looks like we might be going in the same direction. There's loads I haven't had the opportunity to talk about. I've been very keen to talk about Brexit, very keen to talk about any number of other things, and so look forward to your questions and bear with me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So yes, we have heard our candidates' opening 5-minute statements. Now we will be going on to 3 prepared questions which are related to human and digital rights. The first one refers to privacy and mass surveillance. Now, on the passing of the Investigatory Powers Act last year, US whistleblower Edward Snowden said that the UK has just legalised the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. Our communications can now be monitored and analysed, our location tracked, the apps we use and websites we visit stored for up to 12 months, regardless of whether we are suspected of a crime. The security of our devices can be undermined by the mandated weakening of encryption, leaving us potentially exposed to data theft and fraud. These powers have been met with widespread concern and criticism from human rights campaigners, journalists, the legal profession and the technology industry for their ability to erode privacy, freedom of expression and security. Our question is, what is your opinion on the current level of surveillance in the UK, and do you think it has gone too far? We will start with Hilary Benn, please. You have 2 minutes.
It's about striking a balance. Now, take the case of the Manchester bomb, and let's start with retention of records for 12 months. Supposing Mr. Beatty had been completely unknown to the security services. You discover his identity because you find his credit card amid the remains of his body. What is the first thing you and I would want the security services to do? Is to find out, was he working with anybody else? And the reason why the threat level was raised to critical was because they were worried that there were others involved. Now the argument goes, well, we're all happy for you to look at the records of the bad guys, but we don't want you to be able to look at our records. The problem with that argument, and this is what the Investigatory Powers Act in part is about, and by the way, it updated the legislation to take account of technological change, and it was needed. I think parliamentarians on all sides recognise that, is in a case like that, you don't know who the bad guy is. You've no idea. And therefore, if you haven't retained everybody's records, you can't find his records. On the question of WhatsApp, I mean, Bill was making the argument we want them, that society should want the companies to give people a key. I put it the other way round. We all accept, or most of us do, the ability to get a search warrant, to break into somebody's premises to try and find what's there. And indeed, a number of premises were broken into in connection with the Abedi investigation because they were trying to find other materials, potentially bombs. Now, if you accept that that is legitimate, subject to judicial oversight, what is in principle the difference between that and seeing what WhatsApp message he might have sent to his co-conspirators, if that was the case? And I personally wouldn't argue, give me the key so I can look at everybody's, just tell me what was in his WhatsApp message, oh WhatsApp. Now, this is the issue, and in the end, people may say, well, I'm not prepared to accept any of that. As a matter of principle, fair enough, except if in the absence of being able to do that, to try and keep up with those who are threatening our lives, we then fail to prevent a further attack, or one that is being planned, and one of us gets blown up, the question that society has to ask itself, was you being blown up a price worth paying for not having the tools that were needed in order to try and protect us? And that was the debate at the heart of the consideration by Parliament of the Investigatory Powers Act, which was changed in the course of its consideration because there were criticisms and there is now judicial oversight.
I'm going to have to ask you to move on now. Please, thank you very much. We are going to ask the same question now to Bill Pelfrey.
So I don't agree with what a lot of Mr. Benn has said there, particularly regarding WhatsApp. Is you can't selectively break the encryption for one person. You can have a situation where WhatsApp is insecure in general, and where a significant number of people have access to it, often quite distantly, all the way really down to town councils, in fact, as I think is in the so-called Snoopers Charter. But you can't just say, you can't treat it as a search warrant. It isn't something that isn't really fit with the technology. Beyond that, I think it's a mistake to necessarily see these policing matters in terms of technology. There are a very large number of failures that led to the Manchester suicide bomber wandering around in this country and ready to blow someone up. I mean, it's not due to it's not due to the government being able to crack every encryption in the country that he was able to do that. The reason he was able to do that was because there was no checking at the time when Libya threw his family out for being Islamic terrorists. These are problems that could be solved really by very conventional means, conventional policing, where you bring in the associates of a criminal, in his case, and investigate them and interrogate them. These things are these policing types of this type of policing is as old as the hills. I think so. I think it's a big mistake to say everybody has to lose their not just privacy but also the whole commercial infrastructure of that because this person who note wasn't stopped. He was not stopped. He was known to the police. He was not stopped at all. Right.
I'm going to have to ask you to stop there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, your 2 minutes are up.
Okay. So I think that's a false dichotomy.
Right, we'll now be going to Ed Carlisle.
Yes, of course, to balance. We all want balance. But if, and it's not just Edward Snowden, but if, as seems to be the case, we are at the extreme edge of certainly Western democracies or kind of countries like our own, then that would suggest that there is something out of balance. It would suggest we're at the extreme, I guess. And as I said, like if China is citing us as an example to kind of support their own snooping, again, that would suggest that something's possibly out of balance. I mean, yeah, so the Green Party are very much committed to, I suppose, trying to create a different kind of society, one where surveillance and kind of loss of rights is increasingly, I suppose, unnecessary. I think, if you said to me now, should we phase out kind of all kind of surveillance rights right now? I think in the spirit of non-purism, I'd say no, but we need to be setting a trajectory for a different kind of society where surveillance and kind of all these kind of risks to rights are just less and less relevant. There are plenty of countries in the world who are much less at risk than we are I don't know, like if we're critical or severe or whatever, there's a whole load of countries that spend quite a lot of their time in we're fine, no problem, no issues, no bombs expected this week. And so it's a shame that we have, as a country, over decades really kind of created a trajectory where we are either risk from outside influences, but also the risk of people just becoming so disillusioned, disillusioned with society, they're willing to do really extreme acts. And I suppose, agreeing with Bill, I think, on some level, actually kind of wanting to say, can we create a different kind of society where, and a different kind of police force where actually that kind of stuff is less and less relevant. Finally, yes, I'd like to see more independent oversight of security services, and also just going back to the kind of analogy of peer countries. Like, it'd just be worth seeing what are other countries doing, and what's working, and can we learn from them?
Thank you very much. Now over to you, Andy.
Thank you. I'm glad Hilary agrees on the subject of balance. I think one of the key issues was in the question, which is mass retention of data. Is it strictly necessary to collect everything? As Bill said, is it strictly necessary to have the keys to all of WhatsApp? And are they going? Is that practical anyway? Do we have the right to have access to Canadians' messages on WhatsApp? Are they going to have to create a separate key for every country? How do they know which country everybody comes from? So I'm not sure the practicalities work in any case. But if you look at mass retention of data, you've got all sorts of issues. You're collecting data from a lot of people who are innocent by definition. So you've at the very least got to inform them. If that data is being stored by ISPs, for example, TalkTalk, they're secure, aren't they? I would really not trust, I'm not even sure I trust the government as much as some technology companies with their security. So I think as soon as you start opening things up, as soon as you start storing this volume of data, then you are asking for it to get out to the public domain in some way, shape or form. I think, yeah, I mean, we definitely roll that back. Indiscriminate bulk collection just doesn't make any sense. I think when it comes to terrorism, Hillary framed it in terms of terrorism. There are other issues as well. There's crime, of course. Yes, there's a risk there, but can we not come up with a solution that is a little bit more advanced? What about warrants? Okay, currently, if you need a warrant to search somebody's house, why could you not exercise a warrant to search somebody's data records, to open up to request data from WhatsApp rather than simply allow the government full access to WhatsApp, for example? Could you not put in place a technical solution that was swift enough to allow the police to very quickly get permission and get hold of that data? I don't necessarily think the government is thinking along those lines at the moment, and that's why they've gone to this sort of draconian mass collection option.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to have
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Right, we will now move on to our second question, which refers to the Espionage Act. The Law Commission have put forward proposals to create a new Espionage Act that would jail whistleblowers and journalists who handle leaked official data. It would not provide a statutory public interest offence, discouraging the exposure of corruption and wrongdoing. The threat of up to 14 years in prison would have a chilling effect on whistleblowers and the reporters they contact, weakening free speech and the integrity of UK democracy. What is your view on these proposals, and do you believe that whistleblowers and journalists should be protected when there is a clear public interest? We will start with Bill Palfrey.
Well, I certainly strongly opposed to the jailing of whistleblowers in any circumstances. It's not. I think also there's something of a misunderstanding here going on about the significance of the state. I mean, a state is essentially at its root a military construct, and it has secrets, and it will, if you share a military secret, they will certainly come after you, right? Now, that is a simple reality of the world of force, right? But the problem is where you start extending that into wholly civilian matters that really are absolutely not questions of security at all, and are simply a case of people who happen to be working for the government, granting themselves glorious extra powers to really do people if they reveal information. I mean, if you work for a private business, of course you sign a contract that says you're not going to reveal confidential information, and if you revealed some confidential information, maybe you'd be sued, right? And maybe you'd be sacked. But you wouldn't have. But for the government to set themselves up as different and better and stronger on this is I believe, a serious error. This is not the appropriate way for civilian organisations to behave, right? Inevitably, though, I just think a simple, rational understanding of military affairs means that you will never be, and again, throughout history, there's never been a time when the sharing of military secrets has not been punished by the powers that be. And I think it's almost inevitable. You can't use tilting at windmills to imagine that we would be able to stop that. But certainly, civilian matters, no way.
Thank you very much, Bill. We'll now go over to Hilary Ben.
Well, as I think said at the beginning, this is a consultation document that the Law Commission has published that has had a lot of criticism. So there isn't an act currently, there's no draft legislation, there's nothing. I'm clearly, as I said at the beginning, I'm not in favour of a law that would allow journalists and whistleblowers to be locked up. There certainly should be a public interest defence, because this is another issue where it's about the balance. Actually, one of the protections that people have currently is, of course, Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, which is about freedom of expression. And so, regardless of whether any legislation specifically provides for a public interest defence, and my personal view is it certainly should, if this comes to anything. Because as I understand it, the previous Prime Minister decided the law relating to espionage was out of date and should be looked at, and that's why the Law Commission has done its work. The Law Commission is not the government. The government may decide not to proceed with that. A different government may decide not to proceed with that, and I can't see any circumstances in which Parliament would vote to lock up journalists or whistleblowers for up to 14 years for revealing stuff that is in the public interest. But as Bill acknowledged, there are some secrets that the state has which, for understandable reason, it does not want to be revealed to others. And if there is at any point draft legislation, then it's been Parliament's job to look at this and decide where that balance should lie. The other thing I would say about whistleblowing is, because I'm not sure it happened entirely in the case of Edward Snowden, is if there are domestic routes that you can use within your organisation to whistleblow first before you decide to reveal it to the world, I think it's important that they're used, which is why I'm a very strong supporter of legislation to protect whistleblowers, because we all know what can happen in organisations where people are shunned, sacked, ostracised and all of that. And if organisations are going to have mechanisms for enabling people to blow the whistle on things that are not working right, things that are wrong in the health service or the civil service or the local government or wherever it is, it's very, very important that they are used and people who use them are protected.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Andy Nash.
Thank you. I think what both these questions perhaps reveal is that there almost seems to be a default position coming out of government or the civil service or wherever these ideas get dreamt up that is a little bit too much to one side or the other. It seems that the default is to collect more data all the time. It seems that the default is to prevent exposure of information in the form of whistleblowers. I think it also worries me that perhaps there's no expertise there as well in this sort of service. It worries me whether that's a big problem. Clearly, I would agree with what Hilary said about whistleblowers in terms of the right to freedom of expression and the public interest. I think perhaps it has to be in there. I think she's certainly right about this only being a draft. But I think even drafts reveal something about the direction some people want to take things in. And that's why it's really important that you have parties in Parliament who are willing to make a really strong stand against this sort of thing, who are willing to hold all these things up to intense scrutiny and involve experts and not just take for granted things they're being told by certain government departments. In the case of, I think, the government who don't seem to even know how to use hashtags properly. So that's what I'd like to say on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now on to our final pre-prepared question, after Ed Carlisle answers it, of course. Yes, you have 2 minutes, sir. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. So, as I said before, I think, it was kind of partly joking but partly serious. I think we need to reward whistleblowers. We need to, they're playing a really valuable role in society. And I mean, it's interesting because I think there's, if I've understood right, there's been a bit of a differentiation saying, well, if there's a care worker, say, whistleblowing, that's okay, but military secrets aren't. I think actually I could be really missing something, but actually I think if as a country we are committing military misdemeanours and we're kind of bombing people and bombing the wrong people and then covering it up, to an extent, surely we need to take that on the chin and we need to get that out in the open. And if it takes a whistleblower to do it, as opposed to trusting the kind of, I suppose, the security services or the army to do so, or Air Force or whoever, then actually I do think there's a valuable role. Of course, there's like we keep saying, there's balance, and if we're kind of then endangering kind of active operations, whatever, there's there's a danger, but I also think, as I said, I think we need to take, if we're committing misdemeanors, we need to take it on the chin. I think we've also, I think picking up on a couple of comments saying, well, you know, it hasn't gone through yet, and it'll probably, you know, Parliament as it stands wouldn't vote for this kind of thing. Yes, but I suppose we just need, whatever does eventually go to Parliament, if it does go to Parliament, we need to scrutinise it to make sure that it's not just one more step towards a more authoritarian approach. It's not just a kind of the thin end of the wedge. It's not kind of a deeper step on a trajectory towards, you know, another bill in 10 years' time, another bill in 15 years' time, where kind of actually whistleblowers really are getting locked up. And we'd say, I wish in 2017 or 18 we'd blocked that bill that was the thin end of the wedge. And finally, I suppose I'd say, again, can we work for a country? Can we try to create a country where actually we have fewer and fewer incriminating secrets, and so there's just less and less need for, in our businesses and governments, for whistleblowers to act?
Thank you very much. Now we will move on to the third question, which refers to Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, in 1948, Winston Churchill called for a Charter of Human Rights guarded by freedom and sustained by law. British experts drafted much of the text, and in 1951, the UK was the first nation to sign the European Convention on Human Rights. Having directly witnessed how even a democratically elected government could over time strip rights from those it disliked or deemed less human, the drafters sought to enshrine universality and basic minimum standards. The ECHR is not a piece of EU legislation. It is an international agreement comparable to the Convention Against Torture, which the UK has signed at the United Nations. The Human Rights Act brings the rights conferred by the ECHR into UK law and enables any UK national who believes their rights have been breached to take their case to the UK courts rather than the European Courts of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Our question to each candidate is, will you defend UK human rights protections, including the Human Rights Act and our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights? And how will you do this in government or opposition? We'll begin with Hilary Benn.
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, and secondly, by opposing any attempt, if there is another Conservative government, by opposing, if that's the outcome of the election, it's up to you, by opposing any attempt of the Conservative government to get rid of the Human Rights Act and replace it with this thing I referred to earlier called a British Bill of Rights, because we've got a perfectly good British Bill of Rights. It's called the Human Rights Act. It's based on the European Convention. We as a country, as your introduction, which really answered the question, if I may say so, Harvey, we as a country played a really proud and important part in establishing it in the first place. It's here for every single one of us. It's not here for the convenience of the government. It's here for the protection of each of us as individuals. And the courts play a really important part in then applying those principles to particular cases that come before them. And one of the great benefits, as you pointed out, Harvey, is instead of that long trek to Strasbourg, which in the end, Strasbourg, I think in years gone by, ruled that corporal punishment wasn't consistent with the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, in the end, it was done away with. When I was a councillor, before I was elected to Parliament, one of the first things I did when I took over as the chair of the Education Committee was to abolish corporal punishment in the authority for which I had responsibility. So being able to access your rights in your courts in your own domestic country and not making that long journey is a great improvement. As I said at the beginning, I'm really proud of the part that a Labour government played in doing that, and I cannot for the life of me, unfortunately there's no Conservative here tonight unless there's one in the audience who would like to explain why they think it's a good idea. We must uphold and defend under all circumstances the Human Rights Act and the European Convention.
We'll now go to Bill Pelfman.
So my objection to this is that essentially this is an example of bait and switch. What is being presented by Mr. Benn as rights are everyone wants rights. Rights are a nice thing. Rights sound good, right? But this is what actually we're talking about here is the legislative power of judges. When the Human Rights Act, by incorporating the European Convention of Human Rights into UK law directly, this immediately makes a judge a legislator. in UK law. It allows him to overturn UK laws passed through Parliament by MPs, voted on democratically, because he considers, again in our very flexible legal system based on a precedent that he may invent on the spot, he considers that to be a breach. Now this is ultimately this is the rule by judges is not compatible with democracy. And there have been many instances where I think the human rights legislation has been used for really things that are very, very negative and have not been to do with defending human rights at all. And particularly the repeated bypassing of immigration rules is one. And there are. It's something that has been repeatedly appeared in the press. Have been complaints about this. I think there's the previous system where somebody had to, where if something was very, very, very overtly unjust, involved having to go to an external court and it was difficult to bring, was preferable than granting such strong powers to people who are, after all, ordinary people. A judge is an ordinary person. If he is given powers, he will wield it.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you very much, Bill. And at the risk of not forgetting this time, we'll go to Ed Carl next.
So as I mentioned in my opening spiel, the Greens have a good and consistent track record on upholding human rights. Absolutely committed to remain part of the European Court of Human Rights. Absolutely committed to resisting the Conservatives' attempts to water down and everything else. It is a shame they're not here tonight. I suppose, the Green Party are, dare I say, unlikely to be in government in a week's time, which is somewhat of a shame. But you have to be a realist. And I suppose, I think the question is, what would you do in government or what would you do in opposition? I think Caroline Lucas as an individual, but I also think the Green Party as a body have had a good track record of, bringing things to the attention of the public and kind of running campaigns and I suppose being quite imaginative about doing so. So I suppose, I as an individual and I think the Green Party collectively are committed to trying to, get public vision on things that can seem really technocratic and everyone's probably going, it sounds alright because Theresa May says it will be okay. Really wanting to kind of, find imaginative ways to put attention on dangerous things. As I said, we want to extend human rights, particularly, for example, around the rights of the child. We want to try to fight hard to redress imbalances. So, for example, again, around legal aid, trying to bolster legal aid, which has been stripped back, wanting to insert human rights into foreign policy and arms trading. And finally, I was really interested. As I was doing the research, I was looking at the policy page on the Green Party. If you've got a spare day, go and read all the policy pages on the Green Party website. There's pages and pages, and genuinely, it's all really good. But he needs some time, and he needs maybe a bit of drink. But it's really, really good, and it was in particular the rights and responsibility page is really, really good. Looking at power inequalities, looking at interconnection of all things, and also looking at the rights of the planet, and that plays into power as well. The way that,
thank you very much.
Got the idea. Thanks.
And finally, Andy Nash.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd agree on that. I think too few people go look at manifestos. They're actually, especially the sort of halfway. Well, yes, that's true as well. Especially the halfway houses, which are eminently readable, and you can scan through, especially if you have particular interest areas. So I'd encourage you to do that. The worries about judges. I really wanted to follow that straight away, but this is fine. Judges operate on the basis of legislation. Parliaments make legislation. They are operating on the basis of what parliaments have decided. Okay, I've yet really to come across any serious issue of judges in the European Court or the ECJ or our own courts abusing their powers in this way. So when we say about complaints in the press, I think we know exactly what parts of the press we're talking about there. So yes, we would guarantee, if we were majority government, like Ed, I suspect that may not be viable. But if we were a majority government, we would guarantee we would retain European Convention and the Human Rights Act. We'd also put in place a digital Bill of Rights along similar lines as well. I think this sort of fear of power is something to be feared in and of itself. People seem to have developed a fear of things that are out of their control, and many things are, and that's not really the root of the issue. Taking back control doesn't mean limiting the ability of people to look after us and actually enforce the laws. So that's really not a route I think we should go down.
Right, so that concludes our prepared question section of this evening. And now we move to our audience. So if you have any questions for any of the candidates, raise your hand and ask away. So we'll start with the lady at the front here.
Thank you. My question falls into two parts, linked. We live in a so-called representative democracy. And generally we vote for the member of a party which most represents our views through that party's manifesto and their policy commitments. We don't vote for an individual or an individual's conscience. In an age of the internet, social media and polls, it should be relatively easy for our representatives, our MPs, to find out their constituents' views. How do each of you feel about representative democracy? And secondly, many of us live in areas which are solidly Labour or solidly Conservative. And consequently, many of us are effectively disenfranchised. Can you give us your views on proportional representation?
Is there anyone in particular that would like to take that one? Andy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of the few people who does live in an area not solidly controlled by Labour and Conservatives. I live in Hatton, Sheffield, Hallam. So I'm sorry I'm not so local, but it is nonetheless Yorkshire, and I do love Leeds. Representative. Well, actually, let's go on to PR while we're there. Absolutely, I think it's an absolute catastrophe that we do not have a more proportional system. It is a catastrophe that most people do not vote on the basis of a party that most matches their views. Sadly, if they did, I think the Greens and us would do a lot better, and UKIP too, actually. In reality, people vote for one of the two parties that most matches their views because they often get down to the line and go for tactical voting. I definitely would not suggest that in Leeds Central because I don't think that's in any way necessary. You have an opportunity this election to vote with your conscience because I think, I'm not going to spell it out, but I think it's quite clear who's going to win. We're a week away. We're coming from a fairly low base, but I think we should be back in front, hopefully beating the Conservatives. So I would urge you to give us your vote for that reason. But we do need proportional representation. It is unfair that millions are disenfranchised across the country, and to vote against that would be unconscionable. And that is what, I'm afraid, Labour continue to do. Now, I'm aware that actually Hillary on this issue is fairly open to the idea of a fairer system. So I would encourage him, when he returns to Parliament, to bear this in mind and to vote in that way. In terms of representative democracy, I think we do vote for an individual who we trust to exercise their judgment, and that might sometimes involve conscience, especially on serious issues. I don't think that they are a delegate at all. I don't think it would be a good idea for us to have polls. I think, as Churchill said, an MP's first obligation is towards the country and then to their constituency. They aren't just responsible to Leeds Central, they are responsible to the whole country. Much in the same, I mean, I'm a councillor, I'm responsible to the whole of Sheffield on certain issues, and to other issues I'm responsible to my local ward. Thank you.
So there are many political things that I disagree with Hilary Benn on, but the fact of the matter is in the last election in Leeds Central, he got more votes than the other candidates, right? That's why he became the MP, right? This is a very important democratic point about getting more votes. Now, whenever you start talking about so-called proportional representation, what you're saying is that somebody should be a legislator, right, to wield power, to wield force, who didn't win, who was not able to get more votes than any other candidate in that seat, right? That is a profoundly damaging and undemocratic system.
That's not how it works, though, is it?
It is absolutely how PR systems work. Inevitably, all PR systems involve having people who didn't win elections, who did not have more votes. So this is, I think, people should be It's all very easy for small parties, and I would include UKIP in that, to say, well, we think the system is unfair to us. Well, you know, go and convince, if you want to be elected, go and convince people to vote for you, right? You only have to get one more vote than the other candidates, right? So go and do that. But don't expect to be a legislator when you didn't actually get more votes than the others, where you couldn't build that coalition of support. I think that's a very damaging and ultimately weakening measure, where you have ever more people who don't command majority support, who don't command a support base in their constituency, and starts to legislate on in an ever more extreme way. I don't think that I think it's very divisive as well. So and especially I dislike the elevation of parties and party officials over elected individuals, and proportional representation systems inevitably give power to parties to select party lists and take it away from the ordinary electors to select their MP. I mean, ultimately they won't be able to, because every time those four, one from each party, will get in, as we've seen with the European Parliament elections. Ultimately, I don't consider these systems to be representative, and I don't think it's a good or beneficial road to go down.
Thank you. I think all candidates want to answer this one, so we'll go to Hilary Benn and then we'll hear from Ed Carlisle.
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Andy said about the nature of representative democracy. Having been the Member of Parliament in this constituency for 18 years, I take account of my party manifesto, I take account of the views of my constituents and my own views and my own conscience. And to put it in sharp relief, if 99.9% of my constituents signed a petition saying that I, as their MP, should vote for the restoration of capital punishment, I would write back to all 99.9% of them and say, I'm never voting for the restoration of capital punishment, and if you want an MP who will, please don't vote for me at the next election. And I've said that to a number of people over the years. And that illustrates the point. We don't get elected with an empty brain and say, tell me what to think. I have no views, I have no beliefs, no values, nothing. Tell me what to think. That is not the system that we have got, first point. Secondly, the truth about the voting systems is that both have strengths and weaknesses, PR and first past the post. And my preferred approach would be to reform the system as follows, to have the alternative votes system for the Commons in single-member constituencies. I voted for AV in the 2011 referendum. The country didn't vote for it, because it would allow a Green voter in a constituency to say, well, I am voting Green first. I'm not going to vote for someone else because I don't want someone else to get elected. I'm going to vote Green first, and then I'll give a second preference. And I do believe very strongly in the importance of representing a geographical area. Because I tell you from my experience as a cabinet minister, representing an area, doing your surgeries, knowing what's going on, really does have a beneficial effect on the consideration of policy when you're a cabinet minister. And proportional floaters, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, who would not represent an area, would not have that connection. But I would, secondly, have a wholly elected second chamber, elected by proportional representation on probably a regional basis, so you get the strength of both systems, proportionality through your elected second chamber to scrutinise and revise legislation, and an AV constituency-based elected House of Commons. That's what I would vote for, and that's what I support.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, yes, I like representative democracy. Unlike Bill, I don't think our current system serves us well. I think it does a huge disservice to the broad range of people and ideas in our society. I think kind of we end up kind of become very siloed and kind of going down those routes around tactical voting and everything else. And I think it's, yeah, as I said, it does a huge disservice to us all. I think there are good compromise measures. I mean, I suppose the other thing is, it's worth saying, as I'm sure I think everyone knows, we are massively out of kilter with kind of most of our other peer countries. You know, first past the post is not a common system. Most other countries like ours do not, you know, have some form of proportional representation. I think AV could potentially be a way forward. I also think the system they've got in the Welsh and Scottish Assemblies, the additional member system, which ends up with you have individuals for constituents, which I think is really key, as opposed to like the purely regional basis. Like I don't know about you, but I've always voted in the European elections, but I have to say I cannot name our MEPs for Yorkshire and Humber, because I think that having that connection, the constituency connection, is really, really good. Yes to voting reform. An interesting one actually is about just to finish on the second chamber. Yes, I think we should massively overhaul the House of Lords, of course. Probably not, you know, stop calling it the House of Lords. And one thing that you might all think I'm completely crazy, and I don't think it's in the Green Party manifesto. But there's a blog I was reading a few months ago talking about how the idea that actually you could have it the second chamber based kind of on lot. So in the same way that we pick juries by lot, and it works very well, and people seem to take that very seriously and seem to do very well, the possibility you could have some kind of system where actually the second chamber, which is the lesser chamber but holding the kind of main chamber to account, could be actually elected on lot. I'd be interested to explore that. I'm not absolutely staking myself to it, but just a possibility.
Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor again to any more questions. We'll go with the lady there with the first.
One of the first things that David Cameron did when he was elected was to buy water cannons. And we've seen the constant erosion of people's rights to demonstrate and protest. And one of the main problems is that legal aid has virtually finished under these Tory governments. So there's no way for ordinary people, you know, to take legal action in the courts anymore. So I'd like to know what the panellists think about that.
Anyone like to take that one?
Yeah.
Yep, Ed?
I think water cannons are bad, and I think legal aid is good.
Andy as well. Or Bill?
You go first.
So yeah, I agree with Ed. Just recently been dealing with a rather nasty issue in terms of legal aid. And I think one of the issues around that is also funding, the amount of funding available. When it runs out, the rug can be pulled out from under people's feet just when actually they're getting even slightly close to a solution, and it's appalling. Right to demonstrate. I think, you know, we need to look at independently reviewing things like kettling. I think the water cannon, of course, was stopped, and they've been stockpiled somewhere, haven't they? Rather embarrassing for Boris. I think there's a need for a lot more transparency and overview of all sorts of parts of government and the executive, and that's certainly one of them where I don't think we've necessarily got it quite right just yet.
Yeah. So I support the right to protest. That right, I don't think extends as far as actually infringing anybody else's rights. So if that becomes something, even if that disrupts, if that involves blocking traffic, if that involves damaging businesses, and if there's broken windows, any of these things, any violence, any intimidation, all those things, I certainly don't think there is a right to do those things. But of course, definitely the right to peacefully protest. I think it's water cannon. To be honest, it's not a bullet, is it? I mean, it's not. I think as much if they're going to go, if a group of protesters are behaving violently, right, and if, as has been a series of violent protests in this country, then water cannon, I just don't think it matters at all if they use water cannon to break up people who are committing a crime. Okay, but obviously it should not be, if people are not committing a crime, they shouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. Benny, would you like to answer?
Yeah. No, I may have remembered this wrongly. I thought it was Boris Johnson who bought.
Sorry.
Yeah, it was Boris Johnson who bought the water cannon second-hand from Germany. There you are, second-hand water cannon. I don't know how much a second-hand water cannon costs. And this is probably the only time I will say it this evening. I think it was Theresa May's Home Secretary who announced that he wasn't going to be able to use it. So he's now got. I don't know whether he sold them on to somebody else. Indeed, I recall now I was sitting in the House of Commons when she came and announced she wouldn't let him use them, which I must confess came as a bit of a surprise to me. That's probably the only positive thing I will say about Theresa May in the course of the evening. And our right to protest peacefully is really important. And I would just say in passing, I don't actually think we live in an authoritarian country. Because believe you me, you look around the world, there's a long list of authoritarian countries that I'm sure we could put together between us, and I don't think Britain is one of them. And the fact that we got events like this tonight is one of the reasons why we don't live in an authoritarian country. Secondly, I can just read you what it says on the question of legal aid, because it's a very important point that you've raised. Our manifesto says that we will consider the reinstatement of other legal aid entitlements after receiving the final recommendations of the Access to Justice Commission, which Willie Bark, who's a Labour peer, is chairing. The other thing we are committed to do, and this is really important for people at work, the Tories introduced fees to go to industrial tribunals. Now, there are a lot of protections in theory for people at work, but you can only exercise them if your employer behaves badly by going to an industrial tribunal. If you're facing a fee of £1,000, who can afford £1,000 to go when you're not sure whether you're going to win or not? And so we would abolish those fees, because if people's rights at work are being impinged upon or they're being unfairly treated, the reason we passed the legislation as Parliament, and Labour played an important part of that, is precisely to give people at work the right to appear before an independent tribunal to see whether their rights have or have not been infringed. You can't do that. There isn't access to justice if you put such a bar in the way in the form of a high fee that it's absolutely useless, and in those circumstances the rights mean nothing because people aren't in a position to seek redress.
Okay, we'll go with this gentleman next.
Yeah, I find it curious, the attachment to the Human Rights Act. It's not prevented the steady erosion of our civil liberties over the last 30 plus years, one iota. It's no defence of freedom of speech. The qualifications in Article 10 are twice the length of the defence of freedom of speech, and governments can use the Human Rights Act to overrule freedom of speech in whatever circumstances they wish. Rights aren't to be handed down by some benign superstate or judiciary, and in fact there's no such thing as human rights. There are legal and political rights which we win and we defend, and the only guarantee of our rights is an active citizenry. If we don't defend them, we risk losing them. Doesn't mean we can't win them back again, but if we don't defend our own rights, we risk losing them. Right? And the Human Rights Act has been no defence of our rights in this country.
Let's start with you then.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's exactly why I'm opposed to it. You know, how can people deify this legislation when just looking over a period of 10 years that there's been absolutely dramatic loss of speech rights and erosion of right after right. So I strongly agree with you. I don't think that people should be. I don't think people should have formed emotional attachments to legislation. You're trying to. You know, this is a means to an end, and I think by any measure, the European, the Human Rights Act has not been a particularly successful piece of legislation. It's generally been used for some distinctly bogus rights to do with employment tribunals and things like that that really are interfering between the free agreement between people to exchange their labour in any manner they choose. But just to return to an earlier point, the other problem is with the use of legal aid in this field is it becomes a welfare for lawyers. It becomes something that a very well-paid lawyer can create a business, and at that point you can not only actually get relatively random changes in the law, because there is case after case after case where somebody gets legal aid for something like this, and it continues all the way up to the High Court. Everybody racks up enormous fees, and the person who loses is the taxpayer. Ultimately, these things have to be self-funding. If somebody wants to take a case and they can't afford to, then they need to raise money and start a GoFundMe page. It's not something that you can reasonably expect taxpayers who are entirely uninterested in their court case to be fleeced over, so that QCs can buy a second or third house.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my take on this would be, like, I don't think anybody anywhere would claim that any piece of legislation or any act, whatever, is ideal. But I suppose it gives us something to work towards. And so my sense is, and forgive me, I'm not an expert, my sense is the Human Rights Act and others like it, the stuff that came in after the Second World War, has given us something to aim for. I suppose my question is, like, it's not about deifying a particular piece of legislation, but would we want to turn the clock back 30 years or kind of 50 years or 100 years? Like, at the Beeston Hustings last week, I'd like to thank Hilary for making a very good point. Somebody said about freedom of speech and and surely it's all being eroded. And actually, Hilary made a very good point, saying, a generation ago you were allowed to say, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, and that's kind of, do we want to go back to that, or do we want to go back to, as I said, 100 years ago? And so, yeah, the answer is no, but of course. But I suppose there's something about legislation can help culture culture move on and can set new norms. Yes to responsibility and active citizenship. As I said, I'm really keen to get the story of the Leeds man who stood up against ID cards after the Second World War. So I think that in turn will shape our imagination in the city, which I think is important. But I'm also interested in power inequalities and the way, like as I was researching for tonight, was looking a lot about the way in which the media plays, of course, and I suppose big business plays such a big part in shaping our imaginations. And actually, can we try to bring in, I don't know, legislation that kind of, I suppose, reins that in and stops them stopping us. It limits us in our capacity to be active citizens. And finally, I suppose I do have queries. I don't know if this does particularly answer your question. I suppose I have queries about the overarching, human rights. The liberal approach that is all about the individual, I suppose. And I suppose I would want to put that in the context of actually the rights of the collective as well, which I don't think the human rights legislation really does justice to. And I also think the rights of the planet as well. So it's not just about the individual, it's about the collective and the planet.
Thank you. I think what this seems to play into a similar area to the question you asked in Beeston. There seems to be a trend towards taking something like the European, like the Human Rights Act, and deciding that we don't like it, which actually usually I think means we don't like aspects of it, or some people don't like aspects of it, and then deciding the whole thing has to be thrown out, baby and all. And I think the same thing has happened with Brexit. I think that's really not the way we should go. If there's something wrong with something, let's try and amend it, let's change it, let's improve it before we ditch it. On the subject of, and I would absolutely make a passionate defence of the Human Rights Act. I think absolutely it certainly is not something that's not put up in, not been of any use. It's been of use to probably tens of thousands, if not more, people in this country in a most direct way. So I disagree with that premise anyway. In terms of legal aid, yes, of course there are going to be areas where lawyers are making a bit of cash out of this, but at the same time we can't just leave people with very little money, no ability to challenge those who cause them problems. You just can't do that. That's not a civilised society. It's a bit like the dementia tax. we have a contract between us all that means that if any of us fall upon misfortune, we will all help out. That's the general principle. That's what the NHS is based on. That is really what legal aid is based on as well. If we start behaving in a way that means, well, you've got to fend for yourself, doesn't matter how much money you've got, I really don't think that's the kind of Britain I want to live in, frankly. That's really not acceptable. Thank you.
Just a response to something, Bill, you said, because I think it was 25, 30 years ago, the advert appeared, it said, security guard wanted. £1.20 an hour, bring own torch. Now, question, do we think that was an adequate rate of pay for the job? No. Parliament introduced the national minimum wage legislation so that no one was being paid £1.20 an hour. That is, I suppose in your terms, Bill, that is an interference in the right of employers to say that's all I'm going to pay you, but I think society has a right to set certain minimum standards. Secondly, going to your question, sir, I don't think there's a competition at all between, on the one hand, an active citizenry, and on the other, statutory protection for our rights against a potentially overbearing state, because actually one supports the other. Let's take a really unpopular example, for some people, of the application of the Human Rights Act. The government has a policy that if you're a foreign national and you commit a crime, you can be deported. And that is the right to implement your immigration legislation. But someone, they may have been convicted of supplying Class B drugs. They've lived in this country, although they're still a foreign citizen, for 50 years. They married 40 years ago. They have 4 children. They have 6 grandchildren. And they say to the courts, well, please don't deport me. Yes, I've committed an offence, but my family life is here. What is the piece of legislation that enables that person to argue that the government should not deport them, even though they are a foreign national, because of course the government could not deport a British citizen in the same circumstances, and it is the Human Rights Act, Article 8, that allows that person to argue the case, and then the judge has to weigh up, on the one hand, the implementation of immigration legislation, the desire not to have foreign citizens who are practicing crime in the country, as opposed to, on the other hand, the right to family life. Now, the point about human rights is they may not be popular with someone, and they may be really important to someone else, and then vice versa. And that is why we have them. And I suppose I'm saying that I don't accept the premise of the question, because I think it has been an advance for society and a protection for us all.
Move on to another question. We'll go with this gentleman here.
Hi, I'd like to ask the panel what they think about the future of digital rights. In particular, do they think that with technology changing so fast, legislation can keep up? So for instance, if in 10, 20 years we end up in we're living in a world where hackers are so sophisticated that they can hack us at will almost, whether there's anything realistic that legislators can do to protect us.
Anyone in particular like to answer one?
No, we'll start with Ed. Yeah, just a short answer. As I was, again, doing my research, I kind of somewhere wrote, we're always going to struggle to keep up, and I kind of circled it, because I was just looking at it, like, yeah, like, I don't envy those who are trying to bring legislation to get to grips with kind of this stuff. I mean, this is me as an outsider. I presume we are, we've got a whole bunch of people who are absolutely embedded in the digital industries, who are hopefully giving us giving governments the insight and the wisdom they need. Because obviously kind of people on the inside, they're the best place to do that. I suppose kind of, so we are going to struggle to keep up, but I suppose there's just something, and this is a very overarching principle. There's something about just trying to come up with some principles. So what are the principles? What's going to keep us honest? What's our vision for digital rights? What's our vision for rights and human rights in general? And I think if those principles could then form an anchor for us as we create legislation in the coming legislation that we can't even imagine, for technologies we can't even imagine. So for me, it's a lot about principles and wanting to get back to the basics before, yeah, and then building the nuts and bolts of legislation on those principles.
So over the course of my career, I have observed many times that it is impossible for governments to keep up with the pace of technological change in the computer industry and in general. I think it's in general it's a mistake for governments to try to do so, because their first recourse in this is to become ever more draconian and to prohibit more. Because if you are in government, this is, and if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if you are in government, everything looks like an opportunity for legislation to prohibit. So it's the enormous, amazing, really artistic development of the computer industry from the earliest origins in 1938 with the realization that Boolean logic can be expressed in circuits and relays, always the early computers, early computer languages. All these things are exist outside of government, actually, and as actually has all art throughout history, all technology throughout history. This is not something that is the proper domain of art and knowledge and progress are not the proper domain of government, which is essentially force and a military posture. So it would really be a great deal easier if governments would simply stick to, when someone's committed a crime that involves an actual loss or damage, fraud, injury to somebody, things like that, if they would stick to passing laws on those type of subjects and leave the computer industry alone, because really fraud and violence are already illegal, right? You don't actually need a whole bunch of new laws to make the computer industry harder to do and to slow technological progress. I think that would be a very big step forward if legislators would be willing to go down that road.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree to an extent with the last part of what Bill was saying, in that I think legislation needs to be light touch when it comes to any industry. That should be the default course of action. I think I wouldn't agree that you can't take part in an arms race with the crooks and the terrorists in terms of technology. I mean, in terms of terrorists, for example, they're using technology that we use, like WhatsApp already. It's not some secret communications platform, it's something that's in the public domain. I mean, look at Enigma, for example, during the Second World War. People must have thought, there's no way we're going to crack this, but everybody put their heads down and cracked on and literally cracked it. So it can be done, and I think, in anything like this, there's battles you'll win and battles you'll lose. You just have to try very hard. I mean, if you look at the government websites now, for example, where I think actually they're doing a pretty mean job of making information very simple, easy to read, and they're rolling out this standard across all the government websites. It's a far cry from where it was many years ago, and actually it's ahead of what some businesses are doing. Some businesses still have awful websites, incredibly difficult to use. So it can be done. I don't think government is incapable by definition of being government, and it certainly isn't. Government isn't. I wouldn't agree. Government is force. I'll just take issue with that issue as well. I mean, government is about care as well. Government is about defending us. Government is about looking after us. Government is about caring for the least well off, those in trouble. There's a lot of roles of government. It's not just boiled down to one thing.
I was going to say, I think it's a very profound question that you've asked and a very difficult one to answer. I mean, if we really got to the point when no hacking could be stopped and it was affecting people's bank accounts, then maybe the cry would go up to the banks, please return to pen, paper, locked filing cabinets in your local bank branch. But there's always been this measure, countermeasure. Why, in part, are criminals turning to this kind of activity? Because better locks, burglar alarms, smarter cars which are more difficult to break into, and have made it harder for car thieves and burglars. And I think it is the responsibility of the industry to try and keep up to this. I think government has a responsibility to try and help people who are on the receiving end. Take the recent example of, now if I got this right, was it the WannaCry hack in the NHS? Now you think about the consequences of that, I don't know who was responsible, what they thought we were doing. But if you really do lock up all of our medical records and you arrive unconscious at Jimmy's on a trolley, they have your records, they know what you're allergic to, what your dosage is if you're taking medicines currently, but they've got absolutely no way of accessing it because these people have locked it all up for the purposes of trying to extract a ransom from the National Health Service. Do I think that the government has a responsibility to try and do something about it? Well, of course the government has a responsibility to try and do something about it on behalf of all of us. The truth about the technology is we embrace it because of what it offers us, but as your question rightly identifies, it also makes us vulnerable to things that we never had to think about before, and we have to work together to try and find a way around it.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so we'll take one more question. It will be the gentleman with the beard and the glasses.
Thank you. Encryption, it's wonderful mathematical magic. Allows me to create a secure connection to you. So as government, I can create a secure connection to citizens. And without strong encryption, all government digital services will stop. Without government digital services, you will not balance the books of our government. If the government is to hobble encryption, we then give up the ability to do government business online. So this is it's a mathematical certainty. It's binary, it's 1 or 0. It's either secure or not. Sadly, there's no compromise. Politics is the art of compromise, but mathematics is an absolute science. So I'd ask each member of the panel, given you have an absolute choice, you don't have a compromise position, which do you choose? Do you choose government digital services, bringing everything online, bringing us as a country into the 21st century? Or do you choose to surveil the citizens, gather all of our data, and have access to all of what we think is encrypted?
We'll go with Hillary first.
Yeah, although you pose the question and say it's got to be one or the other, I would say humbly back to you, and you have great experience on the basis of the conversation we were having before the meeting started, I think that is a false choice, because encryption, of course, is fundamentally important, as are strong doors to stop the burglars from getting in. The question I posed right at the beginning is, in what circumstances is it legitimate for the state, if you won't open the door, to break it down, to discover the bomb or the material or the drivers or the guns or the people you've kidnapped or whatever it is? And that is the question. That's what this really difficult question of encryption is confronting society with. And you're right, in the end it will be the choice of everyone as to where they want to strike the balance. The point about being a legislator, about being a member of parliament, is whoever you are, the buck stops with you. And if government gets it wrong and a relative of yours is killed, and you say, well, what could you have done differently? And I said, well, we could have done this, but actually in the interest of making a binary decision, yes or no, we decided that we wouldn't. Then in the end, society is going to make the judgment as to whether they think Parliament got it right in balancing security and privacy, which we're all committed to, with protection of our loved ones and our way of life and our society. And like many things in life, it's all about where you choose to strike the balance. And one of the reasons why we are not an authoritarian state is because we have a lively debate and argument and lobbying and amendments in Parliament and so on and so forth, because that is all part of the process. An active citizenry, in the end, informing through their elected representatives where the balance should lie in the legislation that we pass in order to do our duty to protect, while also trying to uphold the right to privacy. And ultimately that is what we will all be judged on. I've been judged in the past, and whoever is elected on the 8th of June for this constituency will be judged in the future.
Yeah, sure. I would certainly say we don't want to hand over keys unless we absolutely have to. Every possible option really should be explored first. I think I mean, for example, I was talking about innovative ideas earlier. I mean, what about legislating for a technology company to have an API available to the security services that the security services were able to call upon in times of need, perhaps with a signed piece of code that assured the system that they had proper permissions from a judge if need be, or perhaps they'd come to the right conclusions through some sort of a process. I think there are ways around this to meet things halfway. So yeah, I would say we definitely want all these wonderful government systems because they are getting much better now. And but I think there probably is a halfway house. And if we are to ever collect data on that, I'm not ruling it out 100%. If we are to ever do things like that, we have to have an incredibly high threshold for doing so, because the consequences of getting that wrong could be dramatic. I mean, you only have to look at the WannaCry situation. That's how secure the NHS is. That holds patient records.
Sorry, if I may, can I remind everyone the reason we had WannaCry is because our GCHQ and NSA weapons of mass destruction got released. These are government tools that allow the government to be on.
I was about to mention that and the fact, I think it was an NSA tool, wasn't it? And the other factor, of course, is funding. Everybody who's ever worked for a company which has any IT at all knows that companies are often loath to spend money upgrading and getting you the latest kit. Somehow that can be a bit frustrating because you're on Windows 7 or whatever. These guys were on Windows XP. I mean, come on. They're the biggest consumers of faxes, I think, the NHS. That is a sign of chronic underfunding, if anything is. And I will plug our policy of 1 penny on income tax, which seems to be very popular. And I think we do need to plug those gaps, and plugging those gaps in all. I mean, we should be concerned as to whether there are any other government services out there that are chronically underfunded and still running insecure systems. And I do really hope somebody somewhere is conducting a thorough audit. Thank you.
I expect you can guess my position on this. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your fine Unix beard there. It's something I'm sometimes tempted to do myself, at least as a form of signalling to potential employers. As you said, there's no. To anyone with experience of this, it is entirely clear that this is a binary choice. Of course, politicians see things in shades of grey, right? But when one is familiar with it, it's very clear that it very, very quickly devolves into that binary choice anyway, because of the nature and limitations of the technology. So, particularly Andy's suggestion for an API. I mean, this is the same as a backdoor. That is exactly the problem, because at that point that is always goes into.
Because with an API you have a lot.
An API is the nature of all software is APIs. That's what it is. It's the nature of. So you can't have one that. You can't say, oh well, we'll just do this one. This one time it'll be fine. As soon as you do that, inevitably that becomes, sooner or later, will become universally available. In the case of the NSA, it did. They were broken into, it was released to the world, okay? And the NSA is greatly at fault for having kept that secret for so many years. And as soon as you have governments behaving in that stupid and ludicrous way, right, inevitably situations like this occur. But also, just regarding the NHS using Windows XP, well, all right, I don't know if the people here remember Lada cars. They weren't very good either during the Soviet Union. The NHS is fundamentally a Soviet system. It goes from the minister at the top of the Politburo all the way down to the cleaner. It is one single non-financial system, and very much the style of the Soviet Union, without gulags, and inevitably systems like that lag technologically. I mean, you can't force, a minister cannot command people at the bottom of the pile to use the correct technology. Now, in private businesses where there is a profit motive, of course, you don't want to go bankrupt when you inevitably leak. If you followed that kind of strategy, you would leak all your customer data to the public, and that would be a disaster. A private business is often usually much more prepared to spend money on it. A command and control system finds it very, very difficult to implement those kind of controls, because while there may be very able people at the top who understand that, or very able people on the technology side, the actual command structure mitigates against giving effective commands in that way. So I think it's almost inevitable that an NHS-style system will have those kind of IT problems.
It's not
from time to
inevitable
time.
because if you properly fund it, and much of the
It's
NHS
not a
is
question
actually
of funding.
subdivided into smaller
Look,
units.
there's a whole load of firms out there that are not funded like the NHS and didn't suffer from this, right? And that's because they were able to upgrade their own systems because they run themselves, right? The reason the NHS wasn't is because it's a big unwieldy organisation. Right?
It's partly technical. They have systems which are only compatible, which last for a long time, like an X-ray system or something which is only compatible with XP.
Yeah,
if you put the money in, you can make sure that these things can be.
And you're talking about commanding people to do that. Commanding people doesn't work. This is fundamentally incompatible with human nature. Commanding people, we're going to command you to do a good job. It's rubbish.
The follow-up act is about some boxing, I think. That'd be great.
Actually, we've done that, haven't we? There was a Lib Dem candidate versus a UKIP girl.
I think it's been something missing from tonight.
Lib Dem.
This is bad political etiquette, but I'm afraid I didn't fully understand the question. I'm afraid I don't know what APIs are, and I didn't get your reference to Beard's bill. So there's quite a lot that I'm missing here. But I am not dashing off afterwards, so I would love to find out all about APIs and Beards and encryption. I suppose just a few comments, and I might be, on the basis that I didn't fully understand the question, this might be way off track, so just give us a minute and forget it if I'm off track. I suppose, the Green Party are very much committed to, if there's a spectrum, we are committed more to the kind of, I suppose, a more liberal approach. Hillary assured us that we're not kind of authoritarian, but if we are, many people would say, actually, no, we, compared to our peer countries, we are far more authoritarian than them. I think we need to be worried about that. I think we also need to be worried about the drift as well. If there's kind of things we're implementing now, legislation that we're implementing now, where might that lead us? Potentially, not definitely, but where might that lead us in a more authoritarian route in 5, 10, 20 years' time? I suppose, seeing as other candidates took the opportunity to go way off message, talking about things that aren't really anything to do with rights at all. I suppose, I joined the Green Party as I believe they have a really positive vision for a different kind of society. I think, for example, it'd be good to have a country where we perhaps, don't have nuclear weapons because, I don't know how insecure they are, but I worry that maybe they're just a little bit insecure, and it'd be a real shame if they went off. And I also think that we need a properly funded health service, and the Green Party are utterly committed to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that is the end of proceedings. Tickets to the UKIP versus Liberal Democrats boxing match are available in the back of the room.
It's like, I think it's a boxing chess match. Just lose the chess.
Well, no, thank you very much to the organisers, Open Rights Group, Amnesty International and Global Justice.